Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, has daily life in Sudan passed a breaking point?
Sometimes you're sitting having coffee during the middle of the day and then you hear an artillery strike. The days that you don't hear the artillery, you start asking, what's happened? What's going on? Why are we not hearing that artillery?
Millions are facing displacement and famine, but they can't leave. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
My name is Hiba Morgan. I'm a correspondent for Al Jazeera English, and I'm based in Sudan.
Hiba, welcome back to The Take. It's been about a year since we last talked, give or take. Sudan is now divided between the Rapid Support Forces, the paramilitary group led by Hassan Dagalo, also known as Hemeti, and the Sudanese army led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan.
A power struggle between Sudan's armed forces and its rival faction, the Rapid Support Forces, has turned residential streets into war zones.
What is your day-to-day life like in Khartoum these days?
So we're in Durman. Khartoum is a tri-city state capital, and we're in Durman, one of the three cities that make up the capital. Now, we wake up in the morning to the sound of artillery fire.
Gunfire, explosions, men with guns now ruling the Sudanese capital.
Either being fired from the Sudanese army military base or the RSF from Khartoum North into Durman trying to target the military air base. So shells would land on the base and sometimes in residential areas around it.
These are the sounds and sights of civil war.
Pockets of fighting between the army and the Rapid Support Forces that grow or shrink on any given day.
So, if you wake up in the morning and decide to have a cup of coffee from your balcony, you would see some dust rising, and it's usually from a building that has been hit by artillery fire from the RSF side.
Khartoum is a city burning with thick plumes of smoke and violence everywhere.
And then if you stay a bit longer, across the Nile, you would see plumes of smoke, some columns of smoke rising from various parts of the Khartoum North city or Bahri. And it's a sound that you hear every day. But that doesn't mean life has stopped. In this part of Durman, people go to the market, they try to buy their essentials when they can. For a lot of people who've lost their jobs, they try to go look for jobs. People have been trying to find simple jobs to be able to support their families.
Is that possible? Is anyone hiring?
Well, that's a sad part. The number of times you'd be passing by a cafe or a supermarket and people are saying, we just need a job. I just need to be able to support my family. And hearing we are not hiring. Some people had to even put up signs that they're not hiring at the moment to discourage people from coming to seek jobs. So a lot of people are now unemployed. They've not received their salaries. They need to support their families and they have to go out day to day. There's a field hospital nearby, and sometimes, we see civilians coming in with shrapnel injuries, bleeding, and it's when you ask what happened, they're like, oh, well, the RSF fired, and they tried to target a military area, they targeted the civilian area instead, and it's become the norm for all of us. It's not normal, it shouldn't be normal, but it is, and then you start wondering, is somebody winning? And who's winning at this point?
Yeah.
In reality, we shouldn't even be worrying about why there's no artillery, because normally in a normal life, in a normal capital, you shouldn't be hearing artillery.
And a year ago, you weren't, which is what I think makes this so surreal, because last year around this time, people were preparing for the end of Ramadan, beginning preparations for Eid. Now here we are, and Ramadan is approaching. Are people able to prepare?
So some families are trying to prepare, and for them it's a tradition. There is this thing we call hilumur, it's like a traditional drink you drink during Ramadan when you're breaking your fast. It's like this crispy bread, sheets of bread that are dried in the sun, and then during Ramadan, they soak it in water until the sweet and sour taste comes out. Now, normally you need to buy the ingredients, but because so many people have lost their jobs, so many people have not been able to earn their salaries, so many people have had to support so many families and relatives that they don't have the financial capability anymore to be able to afford preparations for Ramadan.
Yeah.
The markets, it's like, oh, the prices are skyrocketing.
There is an increase every month. The prices of meat, poultry, vegetables all have become very expensive since the war began.
People are not buying because they don't have the money. And it's not the normal sense of Ramadan that we know in the capital. It's just so different and so surreal. There are a lot of people who actually can't afford a single meal a day as it is right now.
You talked about some people not being able to afford a meal a day, and the World Food Program issued this pretty bleak assessment of where things are in Sudan.
The World Food Program now says what began as a power struggle could become the world's largest hunger crisis.
You've been reporting on the threat of famine specifically and people not getting enough to eat.
So about 2 weeks ago, we were in Muhandisin, central southern Omdurman, which is a bit south from where we are. And that's a place that was besieged by the RSF, so very little commodities coming into the market. One thing I noticed was there is no one who you would see who you cannot tell is starving. Most of the people are stick thin, and it was just a glaring observation. There's no way you can miss it. We went to this house where a doctor has opened her home to try to serve meals for families. And she told me how, during the beginning of the siege, she had food in her home, so she was able to feed her family and those who came in. Eventually, they ran out of that, so they had to break into shops and supermarkets to be able to cook for people. But eventually, even that ran out. And so they came down with this plan where it's like one house would be able to make the food, but then you serve one person one meal a day. Wherever you turn, wherever you look, you can see that people have lost so much weight, and you can see how their clothes are sagging on them. And it makes it even more and more obvious that these are people who once upon a time looked healthy or, had a bit of weight. And they've also told us about deaths. There are cases where people are in desperate need of food and they can't get it because of the siege. Now that's been lifted, so some food commodities have been coming in, but that wasn't the case only in the Muhandisin area. That's the case in many parts of Khartoum.
The past 10 months have been indescribable. There was hunger, there was sickness, the shops were burned in the shelling. People weren't allowed to bring us food or medicine. The RSF prevented people from going to the market. They either rob you of your money or kill you.
And even community kitchens, just because there's a community kitchen in a certain place, that doesn't mean that it's actually reachable or affordable because, again, ongoing artillery shelling, you have to be very careful about when you're moving and how you're moving.
I'd love if you could tell me about Yahya al-Sadiq and his former neighbor and friend Muawiyah, because his story is really heartbreaking.
Well, Yahya al-Sadiq, I met him here in Omdurman. He's a displaced person. He used to live in a place called Wad Nubawi. That's a district in Omdurman. Now, we were talking about, what happened in that area. It was an area that was taken over by the RSF during the first months of the conflict. And then he told me about the story of his friend. He said, oh, and I have my friend and my neighbor, and he was a really good man, and he's in his 70s, early 70s, but he was healthy. He was a football captain. And then he died, but we didn't know until 5 days later.
Movement was difficult, so Muawiyah stayed in the house for 5 days before someone smelt the decomposing body and brought 2 people with him to dig a grave and bury him here.
And then he was buried. And I was like, oh, at the cemetery.
Oh.
And it took me a few minutes to go, what do you mean by in front of his home? He said, oh, because there was just a lot of artillery shelling. The RSF did not allow us to move freely.
There was no way to reach the cemetery. The places were all fighting areas and dangerous and under the control of the rapid support forces.
So everything has just been so surreal in terms of, hearing that story. And he's not the only one. There's so many families that when you speak to tell you about the fact that, our loved ones have been buried in our backyards, or some people who tell you even worse, that we've not been able to bury our family members, that they're still where we left them in the house.
Oh, wow.
So it's just these stories that completely chill your bones when you hear it.
Yeah.
hearing those stories are just simply heartbreaking.
After the break, is there any hope for diplomatic efforts? So, Hiba, I want to talk about where the fighting is now. How do people know that it's RSF soldiers that are not allowing them to reach their homes or to reach the cemetery? How can you tell?
Well, the two sides wear different uniforms. The RSF has a slightly beige with different patterns on their fatigues, while the army, it's greener, darker, and the RSF fighters usually tie this headscarf around their heads known as the kadamol. The RSF it's a paramilitary. It was not a full-on unit of the army. So there were basically two armies within the state. And that's how this whole war started. The RSF was supposed to be integrated into the army. And the army wanted that to happen in 2 years. The RSF wanted that to happen in 10 years, even though the agreement was that, in 2 years' time, there would be a single transitional government, elections, and then, hand over power to civilian government. So the idea that, the army would hand over power to civilian government, but the RSF would be an independent entity or a semi-independent entity, did not sit down well. And that brought the tensions. Of course, it's been brewing for a while, for years, actually.
So, Hiba, we know that ceasefire talks broke down in January between the two sides.
U.S. and Saudi-led talks to broker an end to the war have so far failed. Nearly half of Sudan's remaining population is in dire humanitarian need.
What happened? Did that lead to an escalation? Is one side winning? Is the RSF winning?
Well, even when they were talking ceasefire, when they're trying to talk some kind of humanitarian corridors being open for people to be able to get access to humanitarian assistance or to be able to leave areas of conflict to safer zones, there's always been fighting. It escalates more, ironically, during talks than it does during when there are no talks.
Wow.
But there's always both sides trying to take over new territory. The army trying to regain territory and push back the RSF trying to take over new territory to show that they're winning. But when you look at the entirety of Sudan, the areas that the RSF controls and the areas that SAF controls, it gives the sense of a 50-50 so far. Nobody has a very decisive upper hand, and it's the Sudanese. It's the over 40 million people that are paying the price.
13,000 have been killed in at least these last 10 months. And millions displaced. Let's talk about humanitarian aid. Is it reaching those who need it?
When you talk to aid organizations, the answer is no. When you talk to people who are on the ground, again, the answer is no. And we've seen it, There are places where the aid is reaching, yes. Places under the army control like Kasadam, Tabarif, Port Sudan. These are areas that are relatively safe. So the army is not putting a lot of I would say restraints for the aid to reach those in need. In places like Khartoum, because it's an active conflict zone, a lot of people are not getting aid. Aid is not reaching many areas of Kordofan in the southern part of the capital. Darfur definitely, while the government said that it's allowing aid to come in through one specific point, Darfur is quite a large region. The RSF wants to ensure that they're in control of the aid coming in. The army, because they're the government at the moment, say that they want to control the means of aid coming in, and all of that is just restricting aid delivery to those in need. And because of that, 25 million people, and I want you to know that this is more than half of the population. 40 million is the population.
Wow.
25 million people are in need of aid. There are talks. There's always been, whether it's indirect talks or whether there's some kind of initiatives. That hasn't stopped. The UN has proposed a ceasefire because of the holy month.
I call on all parties in Sudan to honor the values of Ramadan by honoring a Ramadan cessation of hostilities.
That hasn't happened yet. And it's a lot of people, when you ask them, they say, well, we feel like we've been abandoned. We're on our own.
What about the warring parties? Are they suffering along with civilians?
Well, for the leaderships and on both sides, you see them traveling. That's one thing, you see them in different capitals on different dates, talking about wanting to end the war, talking about having Sudanese interests or the interests of the Sudanese people at heart. So there is that.
Hemeti left Sudan through Chad and toured countries including UAE, Uganda, Ethiopia, Ghana, and recently Djibouti.
The leadership of both sides, the RSF and the army, they're not in the capital Khartoum, they're not in Durman, they're not in Kordofan, they're not in Darfur. So one thing I can tell you, while I may not know what their day-to-day life looks like, I can tell you it's definitely not like the life of the people here in Durman that we're seeing every day and we're living along with.
Finally, Hiba, so much of this is about those who stay and what life is like for them as this war goes on around them. And you are one of those who stayed. You had to leave the home that you and your mother built in Khartoum.
Uh-huh.
Do you know anything about how your home is doing and when you'll be able to go back?
So I left on April 15th in the morning going to the bureau, and then the war started. My mom and my family, they had to leave a bit later, about 3 or 4 weeks into the war. And I saw them for the first time in December, so nearly 8-9 months later was the first time I saw them since the war started.
Oh my gosh. It's just too difficult to travel, or it's unsafe?
For me to get out of Sudan means traveling to Port Sudan, which is a 2-day trip from the capital Khartoum now. So I did go back once to bring some of my things during a 7-day ceasefire period. And the house was still standing and I was quite happy. I was able to get some clothes to change. But the thing is, when you have one suitcase and you have to take the very necessary essentials, you just don't know what to take. I took what I could and left and never went back again. But then, there are days where you're sitting and you're thinking about what you left behind. And it's funny how I'd be sitting here like, oh my God, there's this red dress that I really, really love. And now I can't have it anymore because it's gone. It's these little things that you start thinking. And now that, you've lost it all, you start missing them. And, I always wondered, like, what if I just took the red dress?
Yeah.
But I know if I did that, it's like there was something else that was going to pop up in my mind instead of that. Now I know that the RSF did take over my house because they are in our area, and there was a man there who stayed and guarded the property. They kicked him out. The exterior walls were broken so that the military pickups could be put in the house for safekeeping.
Oh my gosh.
So I know quite a lot of damage has been done to the house that we've been building the past few years, but this is what I had from up until December. So I know that some things were stolen.
Oh gosh.
I just don't know what, and I'm always sitting around wondering, is the red dress among them? I'm just stuck on that red dress.
Of course.
It's absurd, but it's because I left it home. It's a sign of hope that I will return. And I don't want to give up on thinking about it because it means you've given up hope on returning, which I don't know when that will happen.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by David Enders and Sonia Bhagat, with Veronisa Campana, Khalid Sultan, Nagin Oliai, Zainab Azar, Sari el-Khalili, Chloe K. Lee, Miranda Lynn, Ashish Malhotra, Amy Walters, and me, Malika Bilal. Alex Roldan is our sound designer. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back.